So once that evaluation has been done and the child's been determined eligible for special education services, then it would be time to write the IEP. And there are several areas of the IEP, content areas that I want to point out to you. Probably the one of the most important ones is the statement of the present levels of academic and functional performance. That really gives you a real in-time picture of where your child is at this point in time. And it's those present levels that then are used to write the goals and objectives on that IEP. There should be a statement about how the disability affects involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. Of course, you will have your measurable annual goals and objectives, a statement of special education and related services, how many minutes of services you will have, how often those services are going to be delivered, and where those services will be delivered. Any supplementary aids and services that your child may need, program modifications and supports if your child needs accommodations in the classroom in order to help them be successful. That's where those would be found. And then finally, one of the other important ones is the LRE explanation. LRE stands for the least restrictive environment. The law says that children need to be educated in the least restrictive environment so that they have access to typically developing peers. The law further states that they should have a maximum least restrictive environment to the maximum extent appropriate for any given child. For some children, they may do very well in a general ed preschool program, maybe with some supports and services, and they'll do fine. For other children, they may need a smaller classroom environment, and that would have to be explained in that least restrictive environment statement or explanation as to why the child cannot be educated full-time with their typically developing peers. So those are sort of the sections of the IEP. There are others, but these are the ones that I feel are most important for you to know about and to look for when you get that proposed IEP home for your review. IEP goals and objectives are really critical to that whole process. It provides a way for family and staff to measure progress on those IEP goals and objectives. The IEP will have annual instructional goals that describe what your child is expected to accomplish within a year of writing the IEP when they're provided with special education instruction and related services. Each goal will have a short-term objectives or benchmarks. Now in Minnesota, the law is that for each goal, you have to have at least 2 objectives. The objectives are sort of spell out how you're going to get to achieving the goal. There are steps leading to the accomplishment of that goal. Goals should be related to the present levels and what your child needs to know or do in order to be successful in the preschool classroom. Goals should be related to increasing your child's level of independence in the classroom and skills needed for positive social interactions with peers and adults. Those social relationships with peers and adults are critical to your child's success in that classroom. If the child does not know how to interact with adults or peers, it would be important to look at a goal in that area. And so that your child is being taught the skills that they need in order to learn that. You would also determine the goal and identify routines within the child's day during which the goal could be worked on. The goal should include criteria to state how the child will demonstrate mastery of the skill and should specify the length of time during which the child will attain the goal. Now, typically goals are written for a year because IEPs have to be reviewed and rewritten annually. They should address the child's functioning in the following areas if needed: participation in the classroom itself and classroom activities, the level of independence that the child is exhibiting in being able to do those classroom activities, even in things like being able to take off their coats. And in Minnesota now it's winter, so taking off those coats and hats and mittens and maybe snow pants and boots, although we don't have any snow on the ground yet, but that'll be coming. And so how independent are they in doing that? How independent are they in feeding themselves during snack time, or with toileting skills? And if the child is still struggling with learning those toileting skills or those feeding skills, again, that could be a goal on the IEP, along with objectives as to how they're going to attain that goal. And then finally, those social relationships that we talked about earlier, that ability to interact and form relationships with both peers and adults. Whoops, I'm having trouble with the cursor again. There we go. So those goals should also identify what are the skills a child needs to master to increase his or her ability to interact positively and more independently with their physical and social environment. Some more information about goals and objectives. The goals should be measurable, including a clear starting or level or baseline and an ending level. On some IEPs, each school district sort of writes IEP goals and objectives a little bit differently. For some school districts, rather than being actually in the goal itself, the starting level might be documented in the present level of performance, or it would be found in the goal itself. Steps to attaining the goal can be found in the objectives. As I said before, in Minnesota, they have to include at least 2 short-term objectives, which are used to demonstrate that the child is making progress toward that goal. And that's the thing I like about objectives is that you don't have to wait till the end of the year to figure out if your child is making progress. Number one, the objectives should spell out how that progress is going to be attained, but also you will receive progress reports during the year that talk about whether or not your child is making progress on those goals and objectives. The goals, as I think I said earlier, the goals are based on the present level of academic and functional performance. The team will determine what skills need to be learned or what behavior needs to change so that your child can be involved and make progress in the general education curriculum, and also make progress on their goals and objectives. Whether your child should increase, decrease, or maintain specific skills and behaviors would be found again in those goals and objectives. And then what level of performance should be achieved and how will that be measured? Goals should always be positive. And so I'm going to kind of say it's not so much about your child decreasing a behavior, but more about the child learning new skills to replace any challenging behaviors. It is what I would like to see on an IEP and IEPs, because when children exhibit challenging behaviors, it's usually because they don't have the skills to do things appropriately. And so changing a challenging behavior is all about teaching the child the new skill in order to get a need met. Some of the IEP goals or activities of the day that you might want to consider. And I like to give this list out because families may not really know what's going on in a preschool day. And this sort of gives you like a checklist to think about when you're going to that IEP meeting and where you're going to sit down and plan what that IEP should look like as far as goals and objectives. So how do you think your child will be able to do during the arrival and departure, during small group times, as well as general playtime, bathroom or toileting, the centers and free play, work time, that would be, individual, where the teacher is giving instruction, teacher directed activities or language and literacy. And you can read these for yourself. This is a list of activities that could occur during the day in most preschool programs. We want a child to be successful in all classroom activities, we can look at these activities and see which ones would be difficult for the child to be successful in, and then relate goals and objectives to these areas. The team should also discuss the activities in which your child would demonstrate a strength, because a child's strengths can be used to work on areas of need. So you can look at that list and see if you can identify activities where your child will be successful and the ones where you think your child might struggle to participate. I see a couple questions in the chat room, so I think I'm going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until the end. I've allowed about at least a good 20 minutes to answer questions. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to go through the presentation and then I will address the comments in the chat room. I hope that's okay with everybody. Then another section of the IEP, as I talked about earlier, was that statement of services. And services can be direct or indirect. Direct services are provided by a licensed special education teacher or a related service professional who instructs your child. Indirect services are also may also be provided by a special education teacher or related service professionals working with other professionals or with the family directly. These services could include consultation, modifications of curriculum, observation of the child, or cooperative planning time. The services are provided on behalf of your child and not directly to your child. The amount of time to provide instruction or service in minutes per session would be the beginning or the frequency. The frequency of services would show that the number of times per week or month that a service will be delivered. The starting date and expected duration for services will be found on the IEP. The location where services will be provided, such as in the regular preschool classroom or in a special education classroom. For some children, services might be provided in the home or in another setting like a hospital or a childcare program. Minutes of service are determined by the professionals working with your child, and they're based on their knowledge and experience. They are saying that with this amount of service, we expect that your child will achieve his or her goal in one area. So an important question for you to ask would be, with this level of service, do you believe that my child is going to be able to achieve his or her IEP goals in 1 year? And that is really the focus of that IEP. They're written for 1 year, so any goal or set of objectives that are written in the IEP should be achievable within 1 year. When we talk about the least restrictive environment, and I mentioned this a little bit before, or LRE, as stated in IDEA, IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is the federal law that governs all special education services. So as stated in IDEA, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled, and the removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only when education in the regular classes cannot be achieved satisfactorily. This section of IDEA is used to support the inclusion of children in typical early childhood programs. Inclusion is a powerful tool because children with disabilities and without disabilities benefit from being educated together. Children without disabilities learn empathy and understanding, and the children with disabilities can learn from their typically developing peers. The typical early childhood learning settings are the placement, the choice, sorry, the first placement choice the IEP team must consider. This could be a preschool classroom, a Head Start classroom, or a childcare setting. And then they would consider what are supports or services would would the child need in order to be successful in that typical setting. Research says that children with disabilities benefit by being educated alongside typically developing peers. The peers serve as role models for social skills as they interact with other children. Children with disabilities also benefit academically because they are being exposed to the curriculum that sets high standards for all children. And that's one of the strong pieces for inclusion is in a typical preschool classroom, there are high standards set based on the curriculum that is being used. And we want those same high standards to be applied to our kids with disabilities so that they're not using a curriculum or no curriculum and are just working on IEP goals and objectives. It sets that high standard for those kids. After the IEP meeting, families will receive a written copy of the IEP along with a prior written notice, which contains the parent consent object form. So if you agree with that IEP that you get home, sometimes from the time that the IEP is discussed in the IEP team meeting, there are some tweaks made to it by the special education staff. So it's important that parents read through the entire IEP, even though they feel like, well, this is something that we discussed at the meeting, and so I'm sure it's okay. I always encourage parents to read through the entire IEP, make sure that the goals and objectives are what they had discussed, making sure that the service minutes are something that they're comfortable with. And if they agree, you have to sign in and return that parent consent object form. And it's important that those forms or I should say, if the parents disagree with something on the IEP, you feel like there's something missing, something that you discussed that didn't get transferred into that IEP, you might disagree with that proposed IEP. Either way, you want to put your agreement or your disagreement in writing on that parent consent object form. You simply check the box that says I agree or I disagree. If you disagree, there may be a couple boxes that say I am requesting another IEP team meeting or I am requesting a conciliation conference. Sometimes it's easy. If there are a couple of different disagreements with the IEP, it might be helpful to have another IEP team meeting. If you go to conciliation, then the people on the IEP team who are involved with areas about which you're disagreeing will attend that conciliation meeting. But you want to make sure that you indicate why you disagree. The law doesn't require that, but I think it's easier for a school to plan for a meeting if they know what are the things that you are in disagreement with. And that might be one of those times, if you haven't talked to a PACER advocate prior to this, that might be a point in time when you want to contact PACER just to get just to be able to discuss the areas about which you disagree and what it maybe should look like or what you would like it to look like, and so that the advocate can help you frame your concerns before you send them off to the school district. And it's important if you if you agree, it's just as important to get that form back because services cannot begin until they have your signature stating that you agree with that IEP. You will have 14 days in which to either agree or disagree with that IEP. But because this is the first if it's the first IEP, nothing will happen until they get your signature back. If this is a subsequent, maybe your child is now 4 and has already had an IEP, it's also important that if you disagree with that IEP, that you send that form back, because otherwise within 14 days, that IEP automatically goes into effect if you do not indicate that you disagree with some part of it. So it's important that you look at that entire IEP and determine what your action's going to be. And again, if you have a concern and want to talk with a PACER advocate, our general number again is 952-838-9000. And that information will also be on the slide at the end of this workshop. Just important information for you to have. There again is our contact information. Our website, along with our general phone number, you can call at any time and leave a voicemail message, and then an advocate will get back to you within 48 hours of receiving that voicemail. If you go on our website, there is a contact form that you can fill out. Again, advocates will respond to that contact form within 48 hours. And then there again is my email address. If you have any questions about the information that we talked about tonight, you can use that email address and contact me directly. Now is the time when I'm going to look at those comments. And please know, when you leave the meeting tonight, your screen will pop up and you can do that online evaluation. If you don't catch it at that point in time, that's okay, because within 24 hours, so sometime tomorrow evening, you will get an email that gives you a link to the survey. Once that survey is completed, if you want to get a certificate of participation, keep that page open and there will be a link to the certificate. We encourage you to do those evaluations. That's a pretty quick evaluation, but it helps us determine whether or not the workshop content fits what you need, or if we need to do any tweaking to the presentation that would help you to a greater extent. For those of you who are used to PACER workshops, you might be used to the 2-hour workshops that we used to do. I think in trying to meet parents' needs, we've decided to shorten up those workshops a little bit, and allow families the time that they need to take care of their families. And so you will notice tonight's workshop is going to be just about an hour. So I'm going to now go into the chat room as soon as I figure out my cursor, and we'll start looking at some of those questions.
Judy, just FYI, the chat room just contains, it was information about the recording and stuff. So there are two open questions in the Q&A panel.
Okay.
And I think if you could probably read the questions, because somebody was wondering, somebody in the chat indicated it'd be nice to see the other questions.
And that's fine. And I have to find there's the Q&A. Okay. Since physical education is part of the definition of special education in IDEA, I should request that my child's physical and gross motor abilities are evaluated by the school district, correct? I want to be sure she is getting appropriate adapted physical education services. I understand that adapted PE is different than physical therapy. Yes, it's kind of a two-part question. Definitely, as part of any evaluation, your child's physical development, which includes gross and fine motor, should be evaluated, because those are both, gross motor gross motor is going to be skills that the child's going to need in order to navigate the classroom, the school building, participate in activities out on the playground. and do the things that any typical preschooler is able to do. And if your child can't do that, the team will determine, and usually what I see in Minnesota is that the children receive physical therapy for gross motor deficits until kindergarten, and then they receive adaptive phy-ed because most preschool classrooms does not include a physical education component. They do like all kinds of activities, but it doesn't necessarily include a physical education component. Adaptive phy-ed is to teach the child the skills that they're going to need in order to participate in physical education program, which usually starts at kindergarten. And so oftentimes children will participate both in, some children will participate both in PE and in adaptive PE, because the adaptive PE will teach them the, well, like kind of like pre-teach the skills that they will need in order to be successful in PE. If there are significant motor delays, then the child may only participate in adaptive phy-ed. I don't see a lot of physical therapy being provided to children once they hit that kindergarten age. I see those gross motor deficits being worked on through adaptive PE. Okay, and then the next question is, can you please give more specific examples of how direct and indirect special education services differ, not for related services, but rather for specially designed instruction for academic curricular areas? Direct services are services that are, it's that direct instruction that is given directly to the child. And so you will see those direct minutes, physical, especially designed instruction is almost, I would say, is always direct service to the child. However, there is time when the special education teacher might be consulting with the general education teacher and staff in the classroom. That would be considered an indirect service because it's not service directly to the child, but it's a service on behalf of the child. Opportunities for the entire team to get together and talk about how your child is doing, and do some of that collaborative planning so that things that are being worked on in special education can also be worked on by the general ed teachers and staff in the classroom. Because if you think about it, oftentimes special education might be delivered, it depends on the needs of the child, but it might be for 30 minutes. But your child is in that classroom, that general ed classroom, for usually it's about 2.5 hours. And so by the special ed teacher and the gen ed teacher collaborating together, that gen ed teacher can be reinforcing what the child is learning in special education. It's the same with OT, speech, or PT, physical education. OT is occupational therapy. PT is physical therapy. If it comes to positioning or helping a child to say the child is learning how to use a particular grasp for handwriting, by the special ed teacher consulting with the gen ed teacher can also be reinforcing that the child is using that correct grip when they're doing any handwriting or drawing activities in the classroom. So it's a way for the gen ed staff and the special ed staff to collaborate and work together is really the reason for indirect services. Anything that the child needs directly, direct OT, direct physical therapy based on the results of the evaluation would be listed as direct service. Anytime it's a service that's more like observing the child and consulting with other members, the gen ed staff would be considered an indirect service. The next question is, let me scroll down here so I can see it. Are there PACER advocates who speak languages other than English? If so, what languages? We have an advocate who speaks Somali and a few other East African languages. And then we have an advocate who speaks Spanish, who works with Spanish-speaking families. We also have access to a language line that folks can use if we do not have an interpreter who speaks or a advocate who speaks the family's language. I hope that's clear. My 5-year-old was assessed using Bergrant's, I can say that all the time, Bergrant's screening, 3 to 5-year-old data sheet. Is that one you agree with or recommend? We don't recommend assessment tools. That is not our job. We are not trained on all of the assessment tools that are out there. We really leave that in the hands of the special education director, special education staff, and the director in a particular district as to what tools they have purchased for use. I would say where an advocate would get involved with an assessment would be if the parent saw the results of an assessment on the evaluation summary report and felt it wasn't a true picture of their child, then we might, say to the family, one option that we might recommend is that you go back to the special education team and let them know that you're not sure that this was a true picture of your child, and ask if there were any other tools that could be used just to make sure that you're getting that clear, accurate picture of a child. Sorry, I can't, speak to the Bergants directly. What advice do you have for families transitioning from an IFSP to an IEP? What would you want them to understand about the differences between an IFSP and IEP before heading into that transition meeting? We actually have a whole separate workshop on that topic, but briefly I will say, because we've got enough time here, I would say that the biggest difference between an IFSP and an IEP is that the an IFSP is an individual family service plan. Many of you participating tonight may have been on an IFSP, but an IFSP is really family-centered, family-directed. It's based on outcomes that the family desires for their child or for their family. And it really, IFSP talks about outcomes rather than goals and objectives. An IEP, Individualized Education Program, is really just focused on the educational needs of a child once they turn 3. IFSP can be based on the family's needs and concerns, contains outcomes for the child and family. IEP is based just on educational concerns that have been identified through that evaluation process. And there are not goals for the family, although the team has to consider any concerns that the family has about the child's education. Another difference is the IFSP is written for a year and services are delivered year-round. For an IEP, services are just delivered during the school year. The only time there would be services in the summer would be if the team determined that the child met criteria for extended school year services, and that would be an IEP team decision. This workshop was intended to be utilized for whether this is the first IEP meeting or if this is a subsequent IEP meeting. So many of the pieces of tonight's workshop would apply to a child, to a family who is just in the process of transitioning from an IFSP to an IEP. the pieces about the goals and objectives, anything that we talked about the IEP would be applicable to a child who is just transitioning in from an IFSP to an IEP on their third birthday. I hope that answers that question. If anybody wants more information, you can certainly tell me, and I will be a little more, I can try to be more specific if that's needed. Okay, this one is going to be interesting. My child's father and his family are not accepting and denies mental and behavioral health in their family, being that they see it as a weakness. How would my child be advocated? I'm not sure what the question is exactly asking. If the mom and dad are not on the same page, it can be difficult to get an IEP that meets the needs of the child. Sometimes if dad is willing in a situation like this, where it's the dad who is not accepting of behavior of mental or behavioral needs for a child, if dad is willing to kind of take a back seat to the educational planning and allowing mom to be present at the IEP meetings and really be the sign off on the IEP, that would allow mom to advocate on behalf of the child. I will tell you that when there is a disagreement between the mom and the dad, PACER does not get in the middle of that. We're really there to help families understand their rights in special education. But we would not sort of be the moderators in a disagreement between the father and the mom. The IEP requires just the signature of one parent, and that's why if dad is, in this case, if dad is willing to take kind of a back seat, it makes it much easier for services to begin. We strongly encourage, whether it's a parents living together, parents being together in a marriage, or parents being separated because of divorce, that mom and dad learn to work together for the benefit of the child. Because if there's disagreements that go back and forth between mom and dad, it really can prevent the child from getting special education services. If mom agrees, but then dad turns around and disagrees, or vice versa, it's going to hold up the child from receiving special education services or the appropriate special education services. So we strongly encourage, as much as possible, that mom and dad are able to work together to meet the needs of the child. Sometimes, if we don't, maybe it's the term mental health that is getting in the way, because dad hears the word mental health and thinks, oh, that means my child is crazy. And I would never use that term. Sometimes, people who don't understand the true aspects of mental health might feel that way. Oftentimes in little ones, we're really talking more about their emotional development and their ability to make friends, to be able to participate in classroom activities. They may have a mental health diagnosis, and some of the more sometimes we're seeing children with children diagnosed with anxiety in preschool. We sometimes see, it's not as common to see kids diagnosed with depression in preschool. That comes a little bit later, but certainly we're seeing more and more young children with anxiety. We see some young children with trauma who've been diagnosed with some kind of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. So we do see some mental health diagnoses in early childhood, but a lot of it comes down to social emotional development. And if the staff could help you to reframe the issue, your husband, the child's father might be more able to accept what's going on if it's reframed in a different way. Um, uh, and then as far as families accepting, um, that's a tough one. And I would, from my own experience, I just felt if my family or my then husband's family could not accept my daughter for who she was, then I was going to limit my daughter's exposure to them because it was stressful both for her and for myself to be around them. And so I consciously limited her exposure to those family members who didn't understand her disability and who, then therefore questioned my parenting and why she couldn't, in their terms, act better than what she did when she was stressed, overwhelmed, overstimulated. My daughter was on the autism spectrum, or is on the autism spectrum, I should say. And so then I would just limit her exposure to them so that, and I saw that as my advocating on behalf of my daughter. And so there were times when my husband simply went alone to his family's activities. It helped that they lived out of town. So that made it a little bit easier to make excuses for us not participating. I don't know if that helps. Again, that's one of those things, if you want to call and talk about it, I'm more than willing to talk on a more personal level with the person who's asking that question. You mentioned extended services. At what point in the school year does that conversation typically happen? Who initiates the conversation, parents or special education teacher? This is the sort of thing that usually should come up in the springtime. I would say, if you have an IEP meeting in September, it's far too early to determine whether or not your child is going to qualify for extended school year services. One of the ways that a child can qualify is for something called regression or recoupment. And simply stated, that means that when there's a break in service, for instance, the first one would be MEA weekend. Then, usually would come winter break and then spring break. And if they're finding that when the child returned to school, they had regressed and lost some skills, and that it took them, quite a lengthy time to recoup those skills, then that's a child who might qualify for extended school year services. And you would have data from that MEA break, or fall break, depending upon what your school calls it, winter break, and then spring break. You would have enough data from those 3 breaks in service to have a discussion about whether your child qualified under that category. There's another category called self-sufficiency, and that would be based on the goals and objectives that are on the IEP, usually around communication and then some self-help skills. So technically special ed should raise the issue, but I'm a strong advocate for my child, and so I never hesitated to bring things up, even though I felt it should be the responsibility of special ed. I was not opposed to speaking up first and just saying, hey, shouldn't we have a conversation about extended school year services? It's getting to be that time. And so I'd like to talk about it. Could we schedule a team meeting? And even though IEP meetings are held annually, at any time during the year, you have a right to request an IEP team meeting. That brings me to the end of your questions. We have about 2 minutes left. I want to thank you for your participation tonight. And I appreciate the questions as well. Just a reminder about the online survey. As soon as you leave the meeting, something will pop up. If you miss that, it will be sent out to you tomorrow evening. This again, just a reminder that Pacer advocates are not attorneys. We do not give legal advice. The content of the materials tonight in the presentation and the materials that you can access are really for information and education only. It's not legal advice and should never be used as a substitute for legal advice. And that's just a disclaimer that we have to make, given that there is a fine line between being an advocate around special education law and being an attorney. So we walk a very fine line and like to always remind families that we are not attorneys and do not act as attorneys for families. I want to thank you for your participation tonight, your questions, and hopefully your completion of the online evaluation survey. Please continue to tune in for PACER workshops. I think it's a great way for families to become educated and learn how to be better advocates for their children. It makes a big difference if you understand the law and what you can expect from a school district, than if you are kind of just go along to get along. Sometimes when we do that, our children are not getting as much the services that they require. School districts are short-staffed and they're doing the best that they can, but sometimes in trying to do that, there are some things that might be missed. So it's important that you are aware of your rights and also your responsibilities in special education. So thank you for tonight and have a good rest of the evening. Stay warm. Those temperatures are dropping tomorrow. So have a good evening and take care.